This will really look at talking about how transparency, stakeholder engagement, and accountability today in the AI world are fundamentally lacking. We talk about AI accountability or justice when really there is no accountability, and it's a systematic environment of injustice. And I come to this topic from the human rights field. I'm a human rights lawyer focusing primarily on corporate accountability, or lack of, I should say. And that's really what got me into the AI world. I'm not a technologist. I'm a lawyer, researcher, and activist. And learning more about AI systems has really shown me how systems of power and oppression, as Oren put in, really are perpetuated and exacerbated in the algorithmic world. So let's begin with a brief look at corporate power. And this is really following up on Andrew's excellent presentation. As we see it today, AI design, development, and deployment is primarily done by the private sector, either exclusively or mainly. Corporations and private sector companies really play a fundamental role in these three aspects, which cover all of the life cycle of AI systems. And if you remember, Andrew shared with you a slide kind of zooming out, and it's a large infrastructure. And this is really against the backdrop of neoliberalism and a fast pace of privatizing social services. And we heard some examples of screening tools, access to medicine. We live in a global pandemic right now where increasingly governments are using algorithms to decide who should or should not have access to a vaccine, for example. So if you take in mind our current economic system, primarily neoliberal capitalist environments and the acceleration of technology, there is an intersection where not only our civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression or privacy, are impacted, but really all of our rights, including economic and social rights. And following up on Orem's excellent presentation and explanation of what colonialism is, we're really entering into an era of digital colonialism, where the majority of these technologies really are designed and developed in the global north, primarily US, Canada, and Western Europe, but they have impacts all over the world. And even though ECNL is a European-based organization, we partner with and support activists globally. And we're really, really thrilled to see some activists from around the world here today. And not to go into deep analysis of how software, hardware, and infrastructure work, but on one side, you have this issue that Andrew said, that everything's developing incredibly quickly, and you don't need many tools to get an AI system. On the other, you see really a handful, 3 or 4 massive corporations, and we all know them: Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, that have most of the hardware, most of the infrastructure needed to actually create massive systems of data collection at a scale that has never been seen before. And this is fundamentally linked to funding as well. We have probably all heard the myth of the brilliant white college boy, Mark Zuckerberg, who came up with an amazing tool, Facebook. But the reality is that the people who have access to funding and VCs often come from upper socioeconomic class, white, usually cis people from the global north, and they have unlimited access to money. Uber and Lyft today are still not profitable and depend on exploiting workers to make a profit or generate resources. And this is all thanks to VC money that not everybody has access to. So just to say that as we think of AI systems, we really need to center corporate power and understand the role of big data within it. And really many of the AI systems we think of today are not necessarily new or emerging technology, but they've been able to scale at such a level thanks to new computing power that is only in the hands of a couple of actors. And this leads me to a lack of transparency. Not to repeat what Andrew said, but the lack of transparency really translates to many different stages of the AI lifecycle. In the design and development side, we really rarely know what data is collected. If it is collected, how, what data is used for training, if it's validated, then the algorithm and model in of itself, the so-called black box, and then even the output, like even if there is an expressed goal or outcome, expected outcome of the system, oftentimes the real hidden expectations and goals of the system are unknown, and these can be either commercial, so profit maximization, or it can be surveillance, control, both on the corporate and the government side. Same for deployment. We rarely know when these systems are deployed, when we are used or using systems. Sometimes there is information, and we can either consent because we really do consent, or because we see no alternative means. And other times we are just unaware that we are being subject to an AI systems. And finally, there's very little transparency in governance mechanisms within the actors that use these technologies themselves, be they corporations or governments. We know very little about their due diligence mechanisms, if they conduct any human rights impact assessment, for example, and what, if any, risk management strategies they use and how they define risk. Is it risk to human rights and people, or is it risks to business, operational risks, logistics? So this leads me to one of the main issues, that today there is really no accountability. There's no regulation that effectively protects us and our rights. In April, actually, last month was an interesting month, especially in Europe, because the EU dropped a draft regulation on AI. The Council of Europe is also developing a framework, and we see increasing interest in regulating AI. But unfortunately, it's still incredibly insufficient. Most of the time, the burden of proof falls either on the victims or on civil society and activists like many of you here, and digital rights experts, to really sound the alarm on some of these oppressive technologies. And unfortunately, corporate lobbying is incredibly fierce. It's expanded anything we've known in the terms of industries or pharma, who have really set the standard high for corporate lobbying. And we've seen many private sector representatives really rush to DC and Brussels as US is thinking about potentially like regulating on a federal level, and the EU as well. So how can we avoid corporate capture at the government level is something that should be really central in our own advocacy efforts as we push back collectively against these systems. So I will end here by saying that this is something that needs urgent and pressing engagement from all of us here. And there's often this misconception and myth that you have to be a technologist or you need to have technical skills, and that the lack of technical skills actually prevents me, you, and us in participating. And I hope that this session today has really busted that myth. And thank you, Orem, for really shining the light on how these systems exist within existing structures of power. One issue, however, that is very true and real, and I wish it were a myth, is how under-resourced we all are. And I understand that with limited time, funding, staff, it's very difficult to participate, especially as you see corporations and governments really increase money in their own capacity in these fields. At the same time, there's this image of techno-solutionism where governments and private sectors tout AI systems by saying that they will solve any social or political problem that exists today, and COVID has definitely accelerated the narrative. And I urge you all to push back against the narrative, asking really, what are the root causes of a problem and what problem are we trying to address? And oftentimes, as Orem has raised, it's not the technology, it really is the system. And then try to unpack the AI system itself and understanding what it aims to do in reality, instead of what are the hidden interests. And I'll finish my presentation by just highlighting corporate capture in civil society as well, as there has been more pressure on companies to actually include communities in the design and development of their technologies. There's also been a sort of human rights washing where really we include communities, but in a way that co-opts our ideas, our values, our concerns, puts a human rights approved stamp on the technology, and really doesn't meaningfully incorporate our concerns in no way. So in this case, in any type of multi-stakeholder participation, we really have to push for distributed and collective decision-making power. We want to have control over the technology and its deployment, and really play a key role in accountability, both at the corporate level and in the governments in policymaking. And we've seen now with both at the EU and UN levels, for example, most of the times when policymakers talk about including experts, and I use experts with quotation marks, they often think about industry representatives or academics, and really leaving out the groups and communities that are already underrepresented, already disproportionately at risk, and who are disproportionately impacted by these systems.